안녕하십니까. 민교협 회원 여러분, 그리고 여기에 참여하시는 모든 분들께 건강히 함께 하시기를 기원합니다. 오늘 저는 서울대학교의 사파리 교수님을 모시고, 그리고 두 분의 전문가 패널리스트를 모시고 최근의 미국과 이란 전쟁에 대한 얘기를 해보려고 합니다. 오늘 강의의 제목은 The Long War in Iran, A Short History인데, 이란에 있어서의 긴 전쟁, 특히 20세기 들어서의 전쟁과 관련해서 이란을 둘러싸고 일어났던 많은 전쟁에 대해서 짧게 얘기를 하는 것이 되겠습니다. 여기서 저희는 현재의 미국-이란 전쟁에서 어떠한 함의를 얻고 앞으로 전 세계적으로 경제와 정치 상황이 어떻게 진행될지에 대해서 저희가 살펴보는 시간이 되겠습니다. 저는 오늘 사회를 맡은 중앙대학교 명예교수 송수영입니다. 반갑습니다. 그래서 지금 이제부터 사파리 교수님의 렉처 강의가 시작되겠습니다.
Thank you, Professor Song and other colleagues who have joined us today. It's my privilege to be in this conversation with you. As Professor Song mentioned, the title of this lecture is The Long War on Iran, A Short History. And the reason that I gave this title is because currently there are a lot of conversations, media conversations, academic conversations about the war on Iran that was launched by the United States and Israel on February 28, which is the second part of, in fact, of a war that has happened against Iran this past year. The first part came in June of 2025, and now we're seeing the second part of this war. There has been a lot of discussion about the immediate context, the nuclear program, the regional context, but I think it's important for people who want to understand this war to see the historical context, the longer historical context. I'm going to argue that this war that we are seeing is a continuation of a specific imperialist policy that the United States has pursued toward Iran, which can be traced back to many decades ago. And I'm going to start this story in the 1940s. When Iran is occupied by the Allied forces, by the British, by the Soviets, and by the United States. Now, the background to this is that by the early 20th century, even though Iran is not colonized, it has become a semi-colony with Britain and Russia, Tsarist Russia, dominating Iran in the early 20th century. During World War I, Iran is occupied by the British and the Russians, and then during World War II, Iran is once again occupied by the British, and this time by Soviet Union. And now this time, the United States has become a new player in the global scene. The United States joins this operation, and so in September of 1941, President Roosevelt establishes a U.S. military Iranian mission. And the purpose of this military establishment is to support the so-called Persian Corridor. Persian Corridor is a route that is used, a combination of railways and roads, to ship supplies from Iran to up north to the Soviet Union, who are now fighting against Germany. So the U.S. joins this operation, and in 1943, in November of that year, there is the famous Tehran Conference when Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill meet in Tehran to discuss the operations of World War II and how the role that Iran should play in this war. Now, this is important because until now, Iranians don't have a negative perception of the United States. The United States is seen as a benign power. Iranians see the British and the Russians as colonial or imperialist powers. But now, when this picture, the picture that you see on the slide, this picture is printed in all the newspapers in Iran, and Iranian people are for the first time realizing that the Americans are actually on the same side as the British and the Russians. The Americans are also interested in their own imperialist interests in Iran. And so throughout this period, throughout 1941 to 1945, we see a continuation and a buildup of U.S. military forces in Iran. At some point, there are something close to 20,000 American soldiers stationed in Iran, supporting the operations of this Persian corridor. And the Allied forces, the British, Americans, and the Soviets control 75% of all the motor transport capacity in Iran, including all the railways and the roads and a lot of the trucks even. And these are used, as I said, to ship supplies to the Soviet Union. But this has a majorly negative consequence for Iranians. 75% of Iranian roads and transport capacity is taken by the Allied forces. A lot of the food in Iran, the food that's grown in Iran, cannot be distributed. Some of the food that's grown in Iran is actually going to the Allied forces and also to European refugees coming to Iran. There are, at this point, over 100,000 Polish refugees who have come to Iran. And a lot of the food that's grown in Iran is going to these refugees and also being taken over. And we see the outbreak of a major famine in Iran at this period and typhus epidemic. This is a period of Iranian history that has not been fully studied, but according to some studies, including one study at Cornell University, almost 3 to 4 million Iranians die from starvation and disease in this period. And so you can imagine this negative consequence. At the time, Louis G. Dreyfus, who is the U.S. ambassador in Iran, is sending these reports. The historical archive is very interesting. Dreyfus is sending these reports to Washington, to State Department, letting them know that the perceptions of Iranians toward the U.S. is changing, and they're changing fast. They're changing toward the negative. Iranians are starting to see Americans as these imperialist powers who are taking their food, taking their roads, and occupying their country. And not only that, Iranians are now having firsthand encounters with American soldiers on their streets. And Iranians are witnessing violence. Iranians are witnessing harassment. Iranians are witnessing this display of sheer power on behalf of Americans on the Iranian streets. So if you look at, as I do, if you look at the Iranian archives from this period, Iranian newspapers from this period, there are many reports expressing deep anger, resentment toward American soldiers in Iran. Just to give you a couple of examples, in Iqdam newspaper in 1943, there is a report that says, talking about American soldiers, they have occupied our country without a treaty. The members of their armed forces throw bottles of liquor on the heads of our people in broad daylight. Or if you look at Iran Ema newspaper in the same year, there's a report that talks about American soldiers saying everybody has seen intoxicated American soldiers shouting and stopping the traffic as a result of one glass of arak, which is an Iranian equivalent of soju. These soldiers swear to heaven and earth in their own as well as in the Persian language. They annoy the passers-by, and the police do not dare do anything with these stout and strong guests. Do not ask me what is happening in the city's half-dark northern streets. Things are taking place which cannot be said here. Or I came across this letter from an Iranian citizen, a woman, written to the parliament from the same year. And she says, "What kind of country and homeland is this when a bunch of dishonorable aliens have besieged its women? We, the people, are truly desperate because of these rascals. Why is no one listening to the people to do something? What should us poor women do in this situation?" So you can get a sense of how the Iranians are encountering American soldiers. So this period, World War II, has a major impact on forming Iranian perceptions toward the United States. But another important episode in the history of Iran-U.S. relations and in the history of what I call the long war on Iran comes in 1953. This is an episode that many people have heard of. This is when the United States and Britain orchestrate a military coup d'etat in Iran to overthrow Iran's democratically elected government, the government of Prime Minister Mossadegh. They overthrow him and they replace him with an autocratic king, Mohammad Reza Shah, and that also has a deeply negative influence on Iranian perceptions. Now, to give some background about this, Iran is rich in oil resources, and in the early period of the 20th century, Iranian oil was dominated by Britain. Britain took monopoly of Iranian oil production, distribution, and Britain became very rich as a result of Iranian oil. The company that we know now as BP, or British Petroleum, was started in Iran with Iranian oil. The British Navy had switched its source of fuel from coal to oil, and so oil became a very important commodity for the British. But while Britain got rich from Iranian oil, Iranians did not receive so much money from their oil. In fact, they received very little from their oil. And not only that, but the British also created a system of apartheid in Iran, in southern parts of Iran where the oil fields are. In the same way that many of you have seen or know of in the apartheid system in the United States, where for many decades there were restaurants, bars, public places where black people were not allowed. In southern parts of Iran, there were many restaurants, facilities, cinemas, sports clubs where there would be a sign saying no Iranians allowed. They were only for British. There were British-only buses, British-only schools. But this was all in Iran, and Iranian people could see this colonial attitude of the British. So in 1951, Iran has a new prime minister, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, and he campaigns to nationalize Iran's oil. And with his efforts and with the support of other people in the parliament, Iranian parliament passes a law in 1951 in March to nationalize Iranian oil and to take over the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and to make it the Iranian Oil Company. Of course, the British do not like this very much. They do not want to lose their control over Iranian oil. And so Britain imposes major economic sanctions on Iran. In 1951, Iran undergoes major economic sanctions, a naval blockade, much like the naval blockade that we are seeing right now, imposed this time by the United States. In 1951, it is imposed by the British Navy. They close all the access to Abadan refinery, which is in southern part of Iran. They prevent Iran from exporting its oil, and they prevent Iran from importing goods from abroad. And not only that, Britain also closes Iran's access to its currency reserves in British banks. So the situation that we are seeing now, Iran under sanctions, Iran under blockade, Iranians have seen this once before in the 1950s. Under these circumstances, Prime Minister Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh travels to the United States, and he hopes to get the Americans to support Iran against Britain in their claim to nationalize their oil. So Mossadegh goes to the United States. He gives a speech at the UN General Assembly. He meets with President Harry Truman in the White House, and he asks him to support Iran in securing its oil rights. But a few months after Mossadegh's trip to the United States, Eisenhower wins the presidential election in the U.S., and in January of 1953, we have President Dwight Eisenhower with Richard Nixon as his VP. And under President Eisenhower, the United States decides that it is going to support Britain in this oil dispute with Iran, and so the CIA joins the UK MI6 to plot a military coup d'etat against Mossadegh. Because as far as the Americans are concerned, this nationalization of Iranian oil sets a bad precedent. The Americans are doing their own imperialism in Latin America, and they think if Mossadegh is successful, then other countries would follow suit. And so what we see in this period, in the 1953 in American media, is this propaganda campaign against Mossadegh. The CIA starts talking about Mossadegh as a communist, even though Mossadegh himself was very much anti-communist. He was a social democrat, but very much anti-communist. but they present him as a communist, they present him as a dictator, they present him as a megalomaniac, they present him as someone who's interested in enriching himself from the oil. And so constantly in American media, we see these negative reports about Mossadegh, preparing public opinion for what's about to come. In 1953, in July of 1953, we see a coup d'etat. First, in July of 1953, there's the first coup d'etat attempt. This one is not successful. Mossadegh finds out about the coup d'etat, and so he orders the people in the military who are loyal to him to prevent the coup d'etat. When the coup d'etat fails, the king leaves Iran because the king was also participating in the coup d'etat. He goes to the United States, and then the second coup d'etat comes. In August of 1953, the second coup d'etat happens where the Americans and the British pay a group of thugs to go to the streets of Iran. They also pay a group of Iranian military men to go with their tanks, surround Mossadegh's house, bomb Mossadegh's house. Eventually, they arrest Mossadegh, put him under arrest, put him in prison, and they replace Mossadegh with a new prime minister, Prime Minister Zahedi, who's a military general very loyal to the United States. After the coup d'etat is successful, the Shah, the king, returns to Iran with American support, and he rules Iran very much as an autocratic ruler for the next couple of decades. After the success of the coup d'etat, the king goes and meets with President Eisenhower, thanks him for supporting him, thanks him for overthrowing Mossadegh. And in this period, in the 1950s and throughout the rest of 1960s, the king increases his powers, shuts down political parties, shuts down newspapers, and Iran enters into this dark period of dictatorship. One of the dark episodes in this period comes shortly after the coup d'etat. This is when U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon travels to Iran to express his support for the newly reinstalled king. Nixon is welcomed by the king, and the king decides to give Richard Nixon an honorary doctorate at the Tehran University, Iran's largest university. Of course, this is something that angers a lot of Iranians. Iranians have just seen a coup d'etat in their country, and Nixon was a big part of that coup d'etat. Iranians very much liked Mossadegh. They supported Mossadegh. They don't like this new regime. And so Iranians come to the streets. There are major protests happening in protest both to the coup d'etat, but also to Nixon's visit, especially in Tehran University, where hundreds of students come out into the common area of Tehran University in protest. The riot police enters and starts shooting at the students. And in these clashes with the police, 3 Iranian students end up being killed. The day of this protest, which is December 7th, is an important day in Iranian history. It's commemorated in Iran as the National Student Day. Under the Shah, the opposition unofficially commemorated this day, and after the 1979 revolution, the day became an important part of the Iranian calendar. Every year, Iranian students remember these 3 martyred students who were killed during Nixon's visit. For the rest of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, every U.S. president who comes to the White House expresses support for the Shah, either visits Tehran or invites the Shah to Washington. They supply the Shah with weaponry, with financial support, and the Shah, of course, serves the U.S. interests in the region. During this period, also an important development is that the United States and also Israel helped the Shah create a secret police by the name of Savak, which is notorious for its torture techniques, for suppressing dissidents, for killing a lot of dissidents. And so, again, these events are shaping Iranians' public perceptions of the United States throughout this period. And so what we see throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s is whenever there's protests in Iran, people would raise anti-American banners. They're protesting not only against the king, but also the king's American backers. And so in Iranian archives and photos, we see a lot of these anti-American graffiti on Iranian streets during this period. And in protest, people raise banners like this one, which says, "We do not need Yankees to run our government. We have our own educated people to replace Americans," because people in Iran get a sense that Americans are running their country. Americans are installing their king. Americans are overthrowing their governments, and that even though Iran is on paper an independent country, it's being run as a colony or as a semi-colony. And so with this background, we get to the 1979 revolution, and this is why in the 1979 revolution, there are many protesters who are expressing anti-American sentiments, burning down American flags, because, as I said, they see Americans very much as the supporter of their own dictator. Now, when the revolution happens in January of 1979, the king realizes that his time is up. There are millions of Iranians on the streets of Iran. This is the Iranian Revolution of 1979 is one of the biggest revolutions in world history, with 10% of the population on the streets. As you know, historically, in many of the massive revolutions, we see maybe 5 to 7% of the population on the streets. With Iranian Revolution, we see 10% of the population coming out to the streets of Iran. And so the king realizes his time is up. He gets on a plane with his family and leaves Iran, goes to Egypt initially, then to Morocco, then to Bahamas, then to Mexico. Eventually, in October of 1979, the king enters the United States, and the U.S. media reports that the Iranian former king has entered the U.S. and he's going to go to Texas to be hospitalized and receive medical treatment. Now, when the news of this is published in Iran, of course, many Iranians are very suspicious. Iranians remember the 1953 coup d'etat, and so many Iranian revolutionaries think there's another coup d'etat on the way. Last time, too, in 1953, the king went to America and a coup d'etat happened. Now the king has gone to America. Americans are probably planning a coup d'etat. And so in this context, a group of Iranian revolutionaries enter into the U.S. embassy in Tehran, take it over, and we have this massive crisis, which Americans remember as the hostage crisis. For 444 days, Iranian revolutionary students stay in the American embassy in Tehran, keeping some of the embassy staff as hostages. Now, one of the things that happens in this period is that Iranian students who have taken over the embassy, they release African-American embassy staff. They also release the women who work for the embassy, but they keep the white men who worked at the U.S. embassy at the time. And their main demand is that the U.S. should return the king to Iran so that the king could be put on trial. And they say, we're going to keep these people as hostages as long as you don't return the king. When the students take over the embassy, Iran's new leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, endorses the students. He calls the U.S. the Great Satan, and the U.S. embassy is eventually turned into a museum by the name of the U.S. Den of Espionage. Again, reference to 1953 when the U.S. embassy in Tehran was involved in espionage operations to overthrow the embassy. So if you visit Tehran today, or in the future, I hope some of you visit Tehran. If you visit Tehran, you can go to the museum. You can see the museum with pictures, photos of the embassy takeover, some of the documents that are on public display, and with the outside walls of the embassy full of anti-American graffiti. The next major part of this long U.S. war on Iran is in the 1980s. Shortly after the 1979 revolution, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi dictator, attacks Iran, invades Iran, and occupies southern parts of Iran. Throughout this war, which continues for almost 8 years, the U.S. supports Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. U.S. Secretary at the time, Donald Rumsfeld, goes and meets Saddam Hussein in Baghdad, provides him with weaponry, with intelligence, with financial support. The U.S. President Reagan meets with the Iraqi Deputy Prime Minister Tariq Aziz in Washington. And so we see this continued U.S. support for Iraq during the war, with one exception. In 1985, the United States government, again under President Reagan, decides to sell weapons to Iran secretly. It had to be secret because Reagan had imposed sanctions on Iran. Iran was under an arms embargo, which remains in place even today. So legally, the U.S. could not sell weapons to Iran. So they find a secret way. The United States asks Israel to ship weapons to Iran, and then the money that Iran pays in exchange for these weapons is used to support the Contra group in Nicaragua, the anti-communist group fighting against the communists in Nicaragua. This is then leaked to the U.S. Media. The U.S. media leaks this. Reports of this are published in the U.S., in Lebanon, and in some other countries. And it becomes a big scandal for the United States, for Israel, and for Iran. Because on paper, Iran is supposed to be an enemy of these two countries, and these two countries are supposed to be an enemy of Iran, but we see these secret dealings. Now, these dealings also are rooted in earlier in the 1980s when Reagan is running for president. And Reagan, reportedly, there are some reports that when Reagan was running for president, he contacted the Iranian Islamic Republic, and he asked them to keep the American hostages in Iran so that Carter could look weak. He didn't want Carter to release the hostages. He wanted himself to release the hostages. So these dealings go back to this period, but we can come back and talk about this if necessary. But except for this short period when the U.S. supports or sells weapons to Iran, for the rest of the war, the United States supports Iraq fully, including near the end of the war. And this is a particularly violent and brutal period when Iraq is using chemical weapons against Iran with U.S. support. The U.S. provides intelligence to Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, and Iraq obtains chemical weapons with support from Germany and France and uses these chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers and against Iranian civilians. In the last year of the war, the U.S. itself becomes involved directly in the war. In 1988, the U.S. Navy launches Operation Praying Mantis, sending U.S. Navy send U.S. carrier ships to the Middle East, the Persian Gulf. They destroy Iranian oil platforms, Iranian ships, boats. They kill Iranian Navy men. At the time, the U.S. does this to, again, make sure that it can control the passage of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. And this is also 1988, by the way, is the first time that Donald Trump, who was a famous businessman in the United States, does an interview with the Guardian newspaper, and he says, if I were president of the United States, I would go and take over Hormuz Island and take over Iranian oil. And now, all these years later, we have Trump doing basically what he said he would do in 1988. When the U.S. Navy is entered into the Persian Gulf and into Iranian waters, a tragic incident happens when in July of 1988, the U.S. Navy shoots down an Iranian civilian airplane. Iran Air Flight 655, and that incident kills all the 290 people who were on board. The U.S. has never formally acknowledged or apologized for this, and of course the event remains a major sort of tragedy and trauma in the Iranian collective memory about the United States. Now, if the 1980s are a very harsh and period of tension between Iran and the United States, by the 1990s and late 1990s, we start seeing some steps toward reconciliation. In 1997, in Iran, there's a new president, President Mohammad Khatami. In the US, Bill Clinton is the president, and both countries start sending signals that they want to work through their differences and reconcile with one another. Then comes September 11 attacks, terrorist attacks in the United States. When that happens, Iran very quickly condemns these attacks. President Khatami and even the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, condemn these attacks and show sympathy to American people. And in Iran, Iranian people, thousands of Iranian people come to the streets, hold candlelight vigils in commemoration and in sympathy with the victims and the families of the victims in the United States. And the sort of reconciliation almost continues in some ways. In 2001, when the Americans invade and occupy Afghanistan, the Iranian government actually helps and supports Americans in Afghanistan. In 2003, when Americans invade and occupy Iraq, the Islamic Republic, Iranian government, again helps and supports Americans in their operations in Iraq. But of course, these efforts toward reconciliation fail very quickly. George Bush and the neocons in Washington put Iran on the list of axis of evil and threaten to attack Iran, invade Iran after they're done with Afghanistan and Iraq. And so for the rest of Bush years, we constantly hear about possibility of a U.S. attack on Iran. The U.S., according to General Wesley Clark, former commander of NATO in Europe, the U.S. prepared a list of 7 countries that they were going to go attack and change their regimes. And one of these countries, the last of these countries, was supposed to be Iran. Throughout the 2000s, and even after Bush is out of office, when Obama comes, this long war on Iran continues. This time, we have a continuation of this war by other means. So during Obama years, Obama continues to threaten military attacks against Iran. At some point, Hillary Clinton says that the U.S. is going to obliterate Iran if Iran increases its tensions with Israel or if Iran develops nuclear weapons. Throughout this period, in Obama years, we also see U.S. involved in cyber attacks on Iran, including Stuxnet, which is a major cyber attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. There are also major cyber attacks, American cyber attacks on Iranian military facilities. During the same period, we see the U.S. involved in assassination of Iranian military officials, while Israel is involved in the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists. And so the war on Iran continues in all of this period. Another major component of this long war on Iran is, of course, major economic sanctions, what Obama called crippling economic sanctions, or what Trump has called the maximum pressure campaign. The sanctions have had a major humanitarian consequence on Iran, causing poverty, destroying the healthcare system, and pushing many people from the middle class into poverty. As we know, Scott Bessent, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, has talked about how these sanctions are very much designed to put so much pressure and pain on Iranian people that the Iranian people would come to the streets and they would overthrow their own government. Now, in this context, faced with all of this, these pressures, threat of war, cyber attacks, sanctions, and with the U.S. having all these military stations in the Middle East and stationing so many American troops in the Middle East, Iran at some point finds itself completely encircled, surrounded by U.S. And so it's in this period, in the 2000s, especially after the Iraq War, that Iran adopts a new military strategy. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iran's military strategy is still very much a sort of conventional military strategy. In this period, in the 1980s, Iran continues a conventional military strategy with its navy, with its air force, and so on and so forth. But in the 2000s, after the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, Iran realizes that its conventional military is not going to work. If the U.S., the biggest superpower in the world, wants to invade Iran, Iran's conventional military was not going to do anything. So Iran adopts a new military strategy, which they call asymmetrical deterrence strategy. It's based on 3 pillars. On the one hand, Iran starts to build an indigenous defense industry, especially focusing on building missiles and drones. Iran has been under a arms embargo basically since the 1979 revolution, so they cannot purchase weaponry from other countries. So they start developing their own weapons industry. They also start building a network of regional allies. So we hear about Iranian proxies. They're not exactly proxies. I can talk about that more. But there are a network of regional allies in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Iraq, in Yemen. And the idea is that if the U.S. attacks Iran, Iran can basically inflict pain on the U.S. through these regional allies. And Iran pursues a strategy of nuclear hedging, meaning that Iran wants to have the capacity to build a bomb if it has to, but it does not want to build a bomb. So Iran does not have a bomb. It does not have a bomb program, as the IAEA has confirmed, but it wants to have all the components of being able to build a bomb. This is very similar to what Japan has, a policy that allows Iran to build a bomb if they decide to. But so far, their doctrine has been they don't want to develop a bomb. And so with the nuclear program, I'll wrap up with this. With the nuclear program, what we see is that it's an old program. It's a program that started during the monarchy in the 1970s, European companies were supposed to build Iranian nuclear facilities. But after the revolution, these European companies, French companies, and German companies refused to build Iranian nuclear facilities. So Iran approached Russia, approached China, and eventually, with some Russian support, Iran decided that it's going to build its own indigenous nuclear industry, which it has continued to do. This became a source of tension between Iran and the United States. But under Obama, Iran and the U.S. negotiated a nuclear agreement. It was negotiated on the U.S. behalf by John Kerry and on Iranian behalf by Mohammad Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister. And so in 2015, Iran and the U.S. reached a nuclear agreement. According to this agreement, Iranian nuclear program would be monitored, would be placed under a strict monitoring program by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, including American monitors, including European monitors. Iran would have a very low-level uranium enrichment so that it will never be able to build a bomb. And in return for this, the U.S. would lift some of the sanctions, not all the sanctions, but some of the sanctions on Iran. This was seen as a major success for both Americans and for Iranians. But in 2018, of course, when Donald Trump came to the White House for the first time, he pulled out of this nuclear program, this nuclear agreement, and in retaliation, Iran, of course, increased its enrichment levels, and it became, we saw an increased level of tension between the two countries, leading to the recent wars. And the last factor I would mention is the Israel factor. When we think about the U.S. long war on Iran, we cannot discount the impact of the Israel lobby in Washington and the impact of Israel on U.S. foreign policy. Israel, which does have nuclear weapons and which is not monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency, its nuclear program, has played a major factor since the early 1990s, Israel has warned that Iran is 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 year, 2 years away from building a bomb. When Obama reached a nuclear agreement with Iran in 2015, the Israel lobby tried really hard to undermine him. Obama talks about this in his memoirs. And of course, when Trump came to power, the Israel lobby put pressure and encouraged Trump to pull out of the nuclear program. And of course, we know that Israel has played a major role in the recent war on Iran. So that's a sort of a short history of this long war on Iran. We can talk about many aspects of this history, but I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel and the audience and to having this conversation. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다. Thank you very much for your brief and very concise presentation. 아주 좋은 내용 있는 발표였습니다. 이제부터 이제 우리 패널 디스커션과 그다음에 그 청중들로부터의 질문을 받고 그에 대한 토론을 시작하겠습니다.
Thank you for having me. So I'm Sonil Kim, and let me briefly introduce myself. And I'm Sonil Kim, working at the College of International Studies at Kyung University, and also working and serving as the General Secretary of the National Council of Professors and Researchers for Democratic and Equal Society. And first of all, I would like to extend my deepest condolence and sympathy to the victims and their families of the war. And thank you very much for the great presentation, Professor Safari. And I learned a lot about the twisted history of Iran because of oil, Western interventions, and the Cold War revolution, Iran-Iraqi war, and the war on terror and the rise of neocons and Zionists, along with the rise and resurgence of Donald Trump, which are the fundamental sources of the current war, definitely. And it was also politically interesting that Donald Trump had his interest in Iran as early as 1988. And now that the ceasefire talk is going to be resumed and the war is likely to end, leaving lots of casualties and devastations. So while we have to understand the historical context of the war to explain the war, tracing back to the Arab imperialism, Cold War, the American dominance, and the post-revolution Iran, we also want to know how to untangle the very historical twist after this war. We may also have to look into the domestic kind of causes of the war, which unfortunately opened the window of opportunity, capitalized and exploited by the United States and Israel. And we can find that the very long war on Iran must have fragmented civil society in Iran. So there might be the pro-Western and anti-Western, pro-Shah, and even the anti-Shah, pro-theocracy and anti-theocracy, etc., etc. And I'm wondering which group of people in Iranian civil society is likely to lead the kind of post-war reconstruction, rebuilding of functioning governance system in the absence of strong political leadership. Which group is supposed to have popularly recognized legitimacy. So I wonder what kind of the political groups are likely to lead the post-war reconstruction and reform, and how many chances are there for the political reform? Aftermath of Arab Springs, so the political peoples end up with having kind of the largely political degeneration in the region. So that's the second question is pretty quick one, and which is about the Israeli factors. It might be because of the limited time, but the lecture does not fully cover the significance of the Israel's aggression and the pursuit of territorial interest in the war. And I would appreciate if you could elaborate a little bit on the Israeli factor in the war. And thank you very much for the great lecture, Professor Safari.
Thank you so much for that question. As I said at the beginning, I feel very privileged to be part of this conversation, and your very insightful question and observations, I think, prove my point that this is a privilege to participate in conversations like this. Your point about internal dynamics is extremely important. It's hard to predict the future, but I will maybe say a couple of points about general setting. of domestic politics in Iran and how we might be able to imagine the future. As you know, during the first decade after the revolution, Iran was still under the charismatic leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini. So politics in Iran was very much shaped around this cult of personality of Ayatollah Khomeini and his charismatic leadership. By the end of 1980s, early 1990s, the war with Iraq is over. Ayatollah Khomeini is no longer in the scene, and we enter a new phase in the Islamic Republic where we see two different factions in the Islamic Republic. One group that's more or less known as the reformists, one group that's more or less known as the conservatives or hardliners. And so since the early 1990s, Iranian politics has been shaped through a contestation between these two groups. Now, external factors have really impacted Iranian politics. Economic sanctions that I mentioned have really weakened in many ways both the Iranian state and have also put a lot of pressure on Iranian society. And whenever Iran is under military threat, whenever there are hardliners or hawks in power in Washington, usually the Iranian hardliners take the upper hand in Iranian politics. So if you remember, I mentioned that in the late 1990s, President Khatami, a reformist, was elected as president, and Clinton in America. When Bush comes and puts Iran under axis of evil, the conservatives, the reformists in Iran basically lose that game. They lose power, they lose their appeal, and conservative president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad becomes the president, very hardliner. And that has happened again with under President Trump. Whenever with Trump too, Iran has increased its enrichment and the nuclear ambitions. So what happens is now with this war, it seems like the reformists in Iran have been further discredited. The reformists, as you know, were negotiating with the United States. Every time the reformists come to power in Iran, they want to negotiate with the U.S. The reformists reached the nuclear deal with Obama. And then when Trump withdrew, that already discredited the reformists in Iran. Then the second time in June of 2025, the reformist government in Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, was negotiating with Americans, and Americans attacked Iran. That discredited Masoud Pezeshkian. And this time around too, in February, Iran was negotiating with the US, and once again, they attacked Iran. Every time, the reformists become more and more discredited. On the other hand, the hardliners have taken the upper hand because they have proven that they are effective. They can put up a military resistance against the U.S. They can build weapons and inflict pain on the U.S. So if I had to make a prediction, and I don't like making predictions, but about the future, is that the conservatives in Iran will have the upper hand. The IRGC, which is the military organization in Iran, will expand its control over Iranian politics. Already, the key person in charge seems to be Mr. Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the House, who's a former IRGC commander. He's the one that has been negotiating now in Pakistan with Americans. So it seems like IRGC will be the main player in charge in Iran. And I will also assume that regardless of who's in power in Iran, if IRGC or the conservatives or even the reformists, social movements in Iran will continue. The Iranian people have major grievances against the state, whether reformist or conservative. They will continue to protest. They will continue to demand for their rights. So if a reform comes to Iran, it's not going to come from the state. It will come from pressure from below. And regarding Israel, if I may quickly answer that question too, I think your question basically contained a very insightful comment, which is Israel itself is an expansionist project. It doesn't have any fixed borders. It continuously take more land from Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, and so on and so forth. That already puts Israel, and of course Israel's military and strategic doctrine is to have military superiority to all the other actors in the Middle East. Israel and the U.S. makes sure that U.S. has military advantage over other countries in the Middle East, and Israel is the only country in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. That puts Israel at odds and on a path of confrontation with any other country in the Middle East that wants to contest regional hegemony. In the 1960s and in the 1950s and 60s, Israel saw Egypt as the main contender. And so, for example, when Nasser wanted to develop a nuclear program, Israel went and sabotaged that nuclear program. Israel was on a path of war with Egypt. Then it was Iraq under Saddam Hussein. In the 1980s, Israel saw Saddam Hussein as the main contender, which is why one of the reasons for Iran-Contra, one of the reasons that Israel helped the U.S. sell weapons to Iran was to inflict pain on Iraq. And Israel also, at the time, Iraq had a nuclear program. Israel bombed and destroyed that nuclear facility in Iraq. Then Israel saw Syria as a contender. And of course, we saw the role of Israel in undermining Syria and Libya as well. And after Egypt and Iraq and Syria, Israel saw Iran as the main contender. And so it has been trying to eliminate Iran as a factor. Israel has been trying to weaken the Iranian state and disintegrate Iran. And already in Israeli media, the talk is that after Iran, we have to turn to Turkey. Turkey is going to be the next target for Israel and possibly Qatar. There has been a lot of talk in Israeli media that both Turkey and Qatar are our enemies. After we're done with Iran, we're going to turn our focus onto these countries. And so that causes a lot of anxiety in the Middle East. This is why you see that even though many of the countries in the Middle East are being bombed by Iran because they host U.S. Bases, they're still trying to put pressure on U.S. to end this war and to contain Israel.
Okay, let's move on to next panelist.
예, 안녕하세요. 충북대학교 이성리입니다. 저는 두 가지에 대해 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 우선 팔레스타인 문제에 대한 것입니다. 이란은 팔레스타인의 하마스에 대한 지지를 표명하고 있으며 직간접적으로 팔레스타인의 독립을 위해 활동해 왔습니다. 이스라엘과 미국을 제외하면 팔레스타인의 국가 건설에 대해 반대하는 세력은 상당히 적은 수인데요. 하지만 여기에 대해서는 1국가 2체제 혹은 2국가 해법이 있습니다. 대다수는 이제 지금 현재 2국가 해법을 이야기하고 있지만 에드워드 사이드 같은 학자는 1국가 2체제를 얘기하고 있기도 합니다. 이란 정부와 국민들은 이 문제에 대해서 어떤 입장을 가지고 있는지 궁금합니다.
That's a fantastic question, and there's a lot to it, so I'll try to keep it brief. It's hard to know exactly the public opinion. I think Iranian, as I have always said, Iran is a very diverse country, very heterogeneous, many different positions. There are some Iranians who are pro-Israel, and that's a reality, and there are many Iranians who are supportive of Palestine, and that's also a reality. The history is quite complicated, and Iran, the Islamic Republic, of course, does support the cause of Palestine. That's an ideological commitment. It's a political commitment. It's part of the anti-imperialist policies of the Islamic Republic. But there's also a geopolitical dimension to it. As you know, even before the revolution, the Iranian king initially started very friendly with Israel, but by the 1970s, the king already was in tension with Israel, and the king was supporting Yasser Arafat, which is because Iran also, even the king before the revolution, realized that Israel is an expansionist project, and at some point Israel will be on a path of confrontation with Iran. So he was trying to establish relations with Palestinians. After the revolution, Yasser Arafat came to Tehran. He was the first major international guest who arrived in Tehran. But then, for a variety of reasons, in the 1980s, the Islamic Republic began to support Hamas. That relationship is complicated. In periods, Islamic Republic supported Hamas. In periods, it didn't. For example, when the uprising in Syria started, Iran and Hamas were on two different sides. Iran supported the government in Syria, Bashar Assad. Hamas supported the opposition of Bashar Assad. So the relationship has had highs and lows. Now, in terms of the official position of the Islamic Republic, the official position of the Islamic Republic of the late leader, Ali Khamenei, was that he argued that we do not support the two-state solution. He said there should be a referendum. That was the position that Iran submitted to the UN as their main position, which effectively is an opposition to the two-state solution. Now, you mentioned Edward Said. I'm very much influenced by him in my own research and work. The late Edward Said, you're right, initially supported the one-state solution. After Oslo, and after Edward Said realized that most countries in the world support the two-state solution, he said, okay, let's support the two-state solution. And so both him and Chomsky, who initially supported the one-state solution, they put their weight behind the two-state solution. I hope, even though it's a flawed solution, it has many limitations, there's international consensus on it. And I hope that at some point, the Islamic Republic or whoever's in Iran joins the international consensus in supporting the two-state solution and find some solution, at least, a step toward a solution for the Palestinian people.
두 번째 문제는 이란의 핵 프로그램에 대한 것입니다. 대다수 핵 보유국은 핵무기를 실제 사용보다는 전쟁을 방지하기 위한 최후의 수단으로 보유합니다. 이것은 핵 억제력을 의미합니다. 상대방이 핵 공격을 하면 상호 확중 파괴로 둘 다 공멸한다는 공포를 이용해 전쟁을 막는 것입니다. 도시 전체를 파괴하는 대형 핵무기인 전략핵은 실전 사용 가능성이 매우 낮지만 특정 부대나 군사시설을 목표로 하는 소형 핵무기인 전술 핵무기는 실제 전장 상황에서 사용 가능성이 높은 편입니다. 국제사법재판소 ICJ 역시 핵무기 위협이나 사용이 대체로 국제법 위반이 될 수 있다고 보지만 국가의 생존이 걸린 극단적인 자위권 행사 상황에 대해서는 명확한 결론을 내리지 않고 있습니다. 지금처럼 미국과 이스라엘이 국제법을 어기면서 마음껏 전쟁을 벌이고 있는 상황에서 이란이 핵을 가진다면 전쟁 억지력을 가져올 수 있다는 생각도 듭니다. 중동 지역의 평화를 위해서는 오히려 이란이 핵을 가지는 것이 더 낫다는 의견에 대해서 혹시 선생님은 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
I can't really speak to it from a legal perspective. That's not my area of expertise. But from a political perspective, I mean, as you know, both U.S. and Israel are nuclear powers, and so there have been rumors, reports that they have considered using nuclear bomb on Iran. In the last few weeks, we've seen these reports, so we have been in fear that potentially Iran could be attacked by a nuclear weapon. And so all of those anxieties, of course, create a sense among some Iranian elites that they should also have their own nuclear weapons. The idea of a nuclear weapon in Iran has been considered a few times. When before the revolution, the monarch started the nuclear program, he asked the Iranian scientists to study the possibility of a nuclear bomb. They studied it, and then he said, okay, we're not going to build it, but we want to have the knowledge for it. Basically, that idea continued after the revolution. They said, we want to have the knowledge for it, we want to have the facilities, that if we want to build the bomb, we can do it, but we're not going to build it. There are important reasons why Iran doesn't have the bomb. You're right that maybe if Iran had the bomb, maybe Israel and the U.S. would have thought twice. But there are at least a couple of important reasons why Iran doesn't have a bomb. One is that even if Iran builds a bomb today, or if Iran had started building a bomb a few years ago, given Iran's technological capacities and military capacities, Israel would still have the upper hand, which means that Israel would have second strike capacity. So let's say in a scenario where Israel and Iran get in a nuclear war, Israel bombs Iran, Iran uses its capacity to bomb Israel, Israel has second strike capacity, meaning Israel has submarines with nuclear weapons that they could easily hit Iran again. Iran does not have that level of technology to have the second strike, third strike, fourth strike capacity, whereas both Israel and the U.S. do. So that has been a major deterrence for Iran. Why invest in a weapon where we can only use it one time, but be hit by it twice, three times, four times? And of course, the second consideration is regional nuclear race. Already Turkey has nuclear weapons, not its own, but Turkey is under the U.S. Nuclear umbrella. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. And of course, Iran does consider the threat that if it develops nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and all the other countries, Jordan would move in that direction. So that has been a major deterrence for Iran.
Okay, now let's move on next. If we have questions from the audience who participate through the online, and I'm going to interpret those questions when it is provided into Korean language, and looking for answers from Professor Safari. Okay, there is one question appears on the chat. When is it going to the Iran and U.S. war terminate?
Very difficult question. I wish I could give you an answer. I think we are seeing some positive signs. The negotiations that happened in Pakistan, Islamabad, Pakistan last week, despite the fact that prematurely, I think the U.S. side said that they have failed. I think there have been some signs toward a mutual understanding, and the U.S. has indicated as much. I think there are good reasons for the U.S. not to continue this war, given that the U.S. is moving toward an election, given the cost on the rising cost of gas in the U.S. There are a couple of ways that this war could end. One is much preferred, I think, for all of us, and one is not so ideal. One way that the war could end is if the U.S. just withdraws without necessarily reaching a peace agreement. In that case, the U.S. will just return, withdraw its troops, withdraw its bombing, but the tensions will continue, and we will continue to see a low-level fighting between Iran and the U.S., potentially through this naval blockade, potentially through exchange of fire between Iran and Israel. That's a possibility, unfortunately. I don't think Iran wants that. Iran wants a full end to this hostility. Given Iran's economic situation, they want the war to end and the sanctions to be lifted. So Iran is, I think, much more committed to a comprehensive peace agreement with the U.S. And I hope that because many other countries in the Middle East too want to see a complete end to the hostility, I hope that there's enough pressure on the U.S. domestically and from other countries in the region that the U.S. commits to a long-term end of hostilities with Iran, lifting of the sanctions, and the two countries moving toward some form of sustainable reconciliation. That's, I think, a much better scenario for everybody involved.
The next question is, currently the number of countries who possess the nuclear arms or nuclear program, and so it means that currently who holds the nuclear program do not want the other countries to purchase or to build up a nuclear program. What is the prospect for these, the situation of increment of nuclear program or decline of the nuclear program? What would be the prospect?
The reality is in the Middle East, several countries are moving toward develop or possessing, I should say, nuclear programs. So of course, we've already talked about Iran, we've already talked about Israel. We know that in the United Arab Emirates, South Korea has helped United Arab Emirates to develop nuclear facilities, and they're maintained by South Korea. And South Korea is currently in negotiation with both Saudi Arabia and Turkey to develop nuclear facilities, nuclear power plants for these countries. Other countries in the region, there have been some indications, some reports that Jordan is also considering nuclear power plants, so is Qatar. So the reality is many countries in the Middle East are going to develop and have some form of nuclear capacity. Among these countries, Iran will be one of the few countries that has its own indigenous nuclear industry, its own nuclear scientists, its own nuclear facilities, that has developed its nuclear facilities on its own. One of the reasons that Iran is resisting this demand from the U.S. that it should dismantle its nuclear program is because Iran fully recognizes that all the other countries in the Middle East are moving in that direction, so it does not want at any cost to give up its nuclear program. One of the interesting proposals that I have seen, which I think, again, would benefit everyone in the region, is that the tricky issue is always not the nuclear facility itself. The tricky issue is uranium enrichment, because it's the level of enriched uranium that could then be used to develop nuclear weapons. Iran, under the nuclear agreement in 2015, agreed to a low-level enrichment. After U.S. withdrew, Iran increased its uranium enrichment level. One of the proposals that I have seen that could satisfy everyone's sort of demand that Iran should have a peaceful nuclear program is having a regional consortium, so that several countries in the region, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, potentially UAE, participate in a consortium so that they develop the necessary levels of enriched uranium together regionally. That would be under monitoring by International Atomic Energy Agency. It would be one consortium that does uranium enrichment for all of these countries, so that these countries can always also be in negotiation with one another, aware of each other's nuclear programs, and a system of checks and balances regionally. I think that would be a very beneficial system. But as long as hostilities exist, as long as Israel plays the role that it's playing, I don't think that's going to happen, and we might move toward a nuclear arms race. But if the conditions for peace are met, then I think this regional consortium would be a very welcomed idea.
Okay, there will come several questions appear on the chat. Some pundits and scholars claim that this current Iran and U.S. war is a harbinger or start of the collapse of the U.S. So then also said that the petrodollar system will be ruined. So what is your prospect and opinion about that?
Because we have an expert in international relations here, I don't feel fully qualified to answer this question, but I will try my best. In the last few years, there was a lot of talk about the world shifting from a unipolar system to a multipolar system. That the rise of China, rise of BRICS, and other sort of Russia, India, Indonesia, we're moving into this multipolar system. I think that assessment was a little premature. We continue to live in a world where the U.S. is the dominant power. However, I think, and just adding to that, I think what we saw in Venezuela was evidence that we still live in a unipolar world. The Chinese were in Venezuela, a Chinese delegation, when the abduction of Maduro happened, and they couldn't stop it. They couldn't do anything to stop that. The Chinese and the Russians couldn't do anything to stop the U.S. attack on Iran. So we still live under U.S. hegemony, under U.S. imperialism. However, I think the result of this war suggests that this war might be, and I said I don't like making predictions, but I'm gonna make a bit of a prediction. This war could be the last major imperialist war by the U.S. The calculation on behalf of the U.S. and Israel was that in 3 to 4 days they can wrap up the war. There were some reports initially that the U.S. had told regional countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, that in 3 or 4 days we're going to topple this government, the Iranian regime will fall, this will be over. Publicly they said 3 to 4 weeks. 6 weeks passed. The Iranian regime did not collapse. They did not surrender their nuclear program. The U.S. was not able to destroy Iran's missile program. Iran continued to expand the war. Iran continued to escalate and counter-escalate, and inflicted a lot of pain on the U.S. and on global economy. I think China and Russia were watching this war very closely. If the U.S. cannot topple Iranian government with all of its military might, we can think what the consequences might be for China.
The questioner wonders that whether this kind of moral, if there is a moral in the international law order and the law rule, could survive. And then if it cannot survive in the future, then what would be the appropriate way to avoid this kind of savagery?
And as you know, A few months ago at the Economic Forum in Davos, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke about this idea of a liberal global order. And he said, you know, for decades we've been talking about, since the Cold War, we've been talking about this global, liberal global order. But he said we all knew that it was an illusion. We all knew that it was a fiction. But we didn't say anything because we, meaning Canada and other Western countries, benefited from it. There was the pretenses that there is this global liberal order, but of course that didn't apply to the Middle East. In the Middle East, people of that region knew very well that there is no liberal global international order. The U.S. invaded and occupied Iraq without any legal basis. Even the argument that was used for the U.S. invasion and occupation of Afghanistan was very dubious. The idea was the U.S. invades and occupies Afghanistan because Afghanistan declared war on the U.S., but because Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group, was in Afghanistan. So the U.S. said the Afghanistan harbors an enemy entity, so we're going to attack Afghanistan. Iran now is using that same logic. When Iran launches attacks on Kuwait, on Qatar, on UAE, Iran uses the same logic. It says these countries are harboring a hostile entity, the U.S. bases, and therefore they're legitimate targets. The U.S. has undermined international law, specifically in the Middle East. Obama was, by the account of many, the drone president. All these drone wars against Yemen, against Somalia, in Pakistan drone bombings. The U.S. has had little regards for international law when it comes to the Middle East and when it comes to the third world generally. And so now the mask is off. Now everybody, when Trump talks about taking over Greenland and taking over Canada and annexing Canada, now the Europeans, now the Westerners are saying, yes, the liberal global order does not exist. We have known, we the people of Asia, Africa, Latin America have known all along this order does not exist. We have entered a chaotic period. International law has been thrown out the window. And of course, we should fight to maintain law, we should fight to maintain some order, but this cannot be a US-centric order because under the US hegemony, international law has not been observed and it will not be observed.
모하마드 모사데크의 실각 시기에 대한 건데요. 분명히 좀 아쉬움이 있었던 시기였고 또 모사데크가 이란 공산당인 투대당과 협력할 움직임을 보였다라는 얘기도 있고 그것 때문에 아이젠하워가 군사 쿠데타를 사주한 것으로도 이제 얘기가 들립니다. 그래서 당시 상황에서 모사데크가 투대당과 협력하려고 한 것은 상당히 이제 좀 냉전 시기에서는 좀 위험한 것이 아니었냐 이런 생각이 좀 들고요. 그다음에 뭐 그것과 관련돼서 현재 이란의 어떤 공산당은 뭐 세력이 어느 정도인지 또 이란에서의 사회주의 세력의 영향이 어느 정도인지를 알고 싶습니다.
Very important question. So starting with the Mossadegh era and the Tudeh party. As I mentioned earlier, Mossadegh himself was very much an anti-communist. And in the US, when they decided to organize, to orchestrate the coup, they began this propaganda that Mossadegh is a communist, which he was not. In fact, the Tudeh party was very much anti-Mossadegh at the time. So when Mossadegh was elected and when Mossadegh started to talk about nationalization of Iranian oil, the Tudeh party, the Communist Party, which was very much an extension of the Soviet Union in Iran, opposed Mossadegh. And they put the argument that instead of nationalizing Iran's oil, Mossadegh should give the oil in northern part of Iran to Soviet Union. Because Mossadegh was trying to nationalize the oil in southern parts of Iran. So in the 1951-1952 period, the Tudeh party organized many rallies calling Mossadegh a tool of imperialism and saying that if you are really an anti-imperialist, then give the northern oil to Soviet Union to show that you're... And of course, Mossadegh did not agree with that. But at the time, Tudeh party was a very organized party. Tudeh party, very powerful, very popular. Yes, and the Tudeh party had many members who were in the military, so they knew about the plans for coup d'etat. Lucky for Mossadegh, one of the head leaders of the Tudeh party was married to one of Mossadegh's cousins. So on the day, as I mentioned, there was 2 attempts for coup d'etat. When the first attempt for the coup d'etat happened in 1953, the Tudeh party learned about the coup d'etat through their military members. Mossadegh's cousin, who is married to head of the Tudeh party, calls Mossadegh and informs Mossadegh that there is a coup d'etat being planned against you. So Mossadegh orders the military that's loyal to him to go and arrest those coup d'etat planners. After this, after the first attempt, then the Tudeh party begins to support Mossadegh. The Tudeh party members come to the streets, protest in support of Mossadegh. But before the first coup d'etat attempt, the relations between them was very hostile, in fact. Now, in terms of what happened to communists and socialists in Iran, after the 1953 coup d'etat, when the Shah comes back, he completely suppresses the Tudeh party. Many Tudeh party's leaders are put in prison, many are executed. So Tudeh party basically became very small. It continued to operate sort of clandestine, but it became very small. In the lead up to the Iranian 1979 revolution, the major leftist party was a militant leftist party by the name of Fadaiyan, Marxist-Leninists who were involved in armed struggle against the Shah. After 1979, the Islamic Republic began to suppress the left. Throughout the 1980s, many leftists were executed, many leftists were put in prison. In my own family, my uncle was a member of one of these parties who was executed in the 1980s. So today in Iran, there are no leftist parties. However, there is a leftist current, which is very strong in Iran because there's an old leftist tradition. There are many Iranian intellectuals who are leftists. In the students in the universities, there are students who are leftists. It's usually if they form a group and call it a socialist group, they would be quickly suppressed. But there are many groups operating under other names, like Students for Justice, or similar names. But really, they're part of this old tradition of the Iranian left. And the workers' movements too. Iran, even though many independent unions are constantly harassed and suppressed by the government, Iranian workers have been mobilizing for a century. And so today too, we continue to see very strong union activism, very strong workers' activism, which we can put in the family of the left.
마지막으로 이제 우리 사파리 교수님에게 이 토크에 참여하신 인상과 그다음에 본인이 발표하고 토론한 내용에 대한 결론을 맺어주시길 바랍니다. 짧게.
Thank you. I think we covered a lot. I just want to thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I want to express my gratitude to the professors for their very insightful comments. Sometimes when I speak to media about Iran, sometimes I say that in Korea, many people don't know much about the Middle East and think that the Middle East is this very far away place that has no impact on South Korea. But of course, today I realized from the quality of the questions and the insightful comments that were made that we are lucky to have so many experts and so many people who know these conditions very well. And I think this is very good. It will help raise awareness in Korea, the fact that these professors and our audience is so thoughtful and engaged in this issue with such care and depth. I think it bodes very well. It's going to raise awareness, and it's going to help young Koreans understand that we live in this very interconnected world. The events that happen in the Middle East, of course, have an effect on us. As when the events happen here, they have an impact in the Middle East. So I really appreciate the questions, the comments, and the privilege to be in conversation with all of you.
굉장히 좋은 시간을 가진 걸로 생각됩니다. 이것으로 저는 사회 보는 것을 마치겠습니다. I appreciate your participation and the very thoughtful comment and responses to the questions raised among the audiences and the two panelists. And also I would like to sincere appreciation to the audiences who participate and deliver the questions about the issues. Okay, I hope this will promote promote the recognition and awareness of the understanding of Iran and U.S. and also in relation to that political and war situation, South Korea could find some opportunity or path to maneuver this very savage or chaotic international situation. 네. 이렇게 복잡한 국제 관계에서 한국이 헤쳐나갈 수 있는 기회를 마련할 수 있는 기회가 되기를 희망하고 모든 분들에게 감사드립니다.
감사합니다.
감사합니다. 감사합니다.